will now give the floor to Francesca Trivellato and Manuela Martini. Manuela Martini will introduce Professor Trivellato for her keynote lecture. So I give the floor to Manuela.
I'm extremely glad to introduce Professor Francesca Trivellato, Andrew W. Malone Professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University. Keynote speaker for the last plenary session at this 19th World Economic History Congress in Paris. Long before she had been invited by some prestigious French academic institution, we met for the first time at another congress in Amsterdam at the very beginning of the present millennium. At that time, she was working on a book on glassmakers in Venice in the 17th century, Fondamenta dei Vetrai. And after this first one, she published a multitude, of course, of excellent works, which I cannot all mention here, except perhaps the familiarity of strangers, the Sephardic diaspora, Livorno and cross-cultural trade in the early modern period, published in 2009, and maybe also The Promise and Peril of Credit, what a forgotten legend about Jews and finance tell us about the making of European commercial society. Let me also remember that one of the co-founding editors of Capitalism, Journal of History and Economics, whose presentation yesterday afternoon some of you may be attending, and most of all, just to say that across her work, she tackles from different angles a question that concerns us directly. That is a gap between the ways economies thought in different times and the context, and how economic actors act in practice. For these reasons, I'm particularly happy to leave the floor to Professor Francesca Trivellato.
Thank you, Manuela, and thanks to all of you who are here. It's been an exhilarating but also exhausting week, so thanks for the forbearance of those of you who are here. We are all in great debt to Liliane Perez, Guillaume Dodin, and their entire team, so please, a round of applause. So I'm going to start with a slide about the present, although I will not speak about the present. These are two graphs about so-called wage gap from the Department of Labor, US Department of Labor Statistics. There are several ways of reading these graphs about the annual the median annual earnings by sex, race, and ethnicity from the 1970s to the now. One is the notion of progress, but I dare to say that Martin Luther King, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, is an important political slogan, but it's not an analytical tool. And I don't think we learn much from looking at history through the prism of the glass half full or half empty. Two other ways there are two other takeaways from this graph that I think are important. One, obviously, that progress is awfully slow and that the market does not correct for everything, but also that progress is very uneven. And so there are very different rates of growth or not growth for different groups. So, for example, for African American men and Hispanic men, there actually is no progress at all in their earnings. By now, there exists a robust literature, not only in history and sociology, but also in economics, on discrimination in labor, credit, and consumer markets and the ways to measure it. There have also been efforts to bridge disciplinary divides and grapple with what economists call pre-market discrimination and what historians and sociologists usually refer to as structural discrimination. That is, discrimination that is the result of elements that individuals cannot control. One such effort is this book. The word identity has long been absent, if not even a taboo, in quantitative economics and a hallmark in the humanities. And it has now made its way into standard economic models. George Ackleroth and Rachel Cranton argue that social norms associated with imputed or chosen identity affect individuals' economic performances and opportunities, whether positively or negatively. Now, this particular work is not without its critics, but signals the need for new analytical tool because the data themselves tell us that we need to take identity seriously. For example, there has been anti-discrimination legislation in place for a fairly long time, and yet the wage gap persists. There are also ample data that show that different compensation levels exist even among people with the same educational background. But my question is, what is the place of identity in economic history? How did legal and social identities that were imposed and formed outside of the market influence market transactions in the past? And how, in turn, did the market alter those identities? Are there ways of addressing this conundrum in ways that may satisfy both historians and economists? I think these are very difficult questions, and I'm all too aware of the fact that many people before me have grappled with these questions. So let me turn to address them by focusing on a particular topic, namely the working of commercial credit in pre-modern Europe. Why credit and why commercial credit in particular? The title of this presentation, The Many Facets of Credit, is simply a description. It's something that captures the nature of the beast. When somebody decides to whom to lend and at what interest rate, multiple elements factor into that decision, and it is a challenge for us scholars to disentangle those factors. The task is for us to think of ways to understand how actors in the past assessed and mitigated the risks that credit entail when they didn't share their thought process with us. And this puzzle is all the more challenging, but also interesting with regard to commercial credit. That is, credit that is extended without collateral, without some material collateral. Credit in which the collateral is the borrower's reputation. This is how the vast majority of long-distance trade was fueled and financed in the early modern period. This is how Adam Smith put it when he wrote that the credit that someone may get from other people depends not upon the nature of his trade, but upon their opinion of his fortune, probity, and prudence. And by focusing on Europe during the early modern period, between roughly 1500 and 1800, there are at least three conditions that make the puzzle of how merchants formed this opinion particularly challenging to ascertain and particularly intriguing. The first condition is that what today we call discrimination was in fact a God-given social order. Separate and unequal was the principle governing relations between individuals and between corporate groups and the state. So women were subordinate to men, commoners to aristocrats, slaves to owners, foreigners to locals, religious minorities to the members of religious majority. Law dictated and enacted the terms by which societies were segregated and hierarchical. But everyday reality, as well as policy decisions, made these terms highly unstable. Conflicts erupted, boundaries were redrawn, social and geographical mobility was ubiquitous, fiscal systems favored one group over another at different moments, as we've learned from a number of sessions on inequality at this very conference. Now, commerce acted as a partial solvent of segregation and hierarchies in many Western European countries, all the more so after 1500, when interstate competition for the control of overseas trade and colonial conquest intensified. Some European states responded to this competition by making special provisions to attract foreigners and ethno-religious communities that were particularly involved in long-distance trade. The privileges afforded to these groups within the mercantilist systems of the time, which benefited homegrown manufacturers and local merchants, were considerable. And that's why in the second part of the presentation, I'll focus on our comparisons, because the way foreigners and other communities were accommodated varied greatly. But overall, while joint stock corporations, such as the English and the Dutch East India Companies, enforced national oligopolies by acting as military, diplomatic, and commercial arms of their respective states, the vast universe of private trade became more open and competitive as international merchants after the 16th century ceased for the most part to be organized in guilds. Now, in addition to these tension, which we may call between corporatism and individualism, the third reason why assessing how merchants devised their opinions of one another is particularly intriguing is because while all these changes were underway in the realm of political economy, the transportation infrastructure, the information technology, and interstate legal enforcement remained weak. And this had particular effects on how reputation, what Adam Smith called opinion, was built. While new overseas routes were opened and some improvement in shipping technology occurred, the invention of the printing press only affected a small part of the information sector. And here is where an important distinction, I think, should be made. There were, of course, an outpour of printed lists of prices, exchange rates, stock valuations, and this outpour of print did arguably standardize valuations locally. By the late 16th century, there were also all across Western Europe a great number of gazettes and other such periodicals that disseminated news, more or less reliable news, about major events influencing the markets, the arrival of a big cargo of silver from the Americas, a military defeat, a major piracy attack, and so forth. And soon, some of these periodicals began to include advertisements of products, including the notorious slaves auctions. But the integrity and solvency of myriad small and mid-leveling merchants did not belong to the public domain and remain largely untouched by the explosion of printed material. It was not possible to audit firms' books, and only occasionally in the 18th century was the bankruptcy of major partnerships advertised in some British newspaper, and even that usually occurred when it was all too late. So public sources of information were of little use to ascertain the reputation of potential creditors or customers. This type of information remained highly proprietary. Word-of-mouth communication, instead, continued to matter. Business letters relayed more or less reliable bits of comments gathered in public squares, along the docks, in coffee houses, and so forth. And this is one of the reasons why business letters remained crucial to the conduct of long-distance trade all through the 19th century. Now, in his important assessment of the contribution of the economics of information to 20th century economics, Joseph Stiglitz admitted that markets for information are inherently characterized by imperfections of information concerning what it is purchased. And mechanisms like reputation, which played no role at all in traditional competitive theory, are central. But in fact, reputation is something that economists have not dealt very much with. Other scholars have, and so how have economic historians studied reputation? How did merchants form their opinion of someone's fortune, probity, and prudence before the invention of the telegraph and credit scores? Did commercial credit markets become more impersonal in the sense that lenders determine the creditworthiness of individual borrowers irrespective of his or her identity? Or did identity continue to matter, and how did it shape individual reputation? Now, I think it's fair to say, and I'm happy to be challenged on this, that most economic history literature approaches this problem in search for moments of rupture, in a sort of yes and no answers to these big questions. This is the case of the justly famous work by Avner Greif on medieval Mediterranean trade. There is some noticeable evolution in Greif's own treatment of identity and cultural beliefs across his own work, but fundamentally he stresses that in 13th century Genoa, new legal institutions allowed for the diversification of commercial partners as opposed to the more inward-looking operations conducted by Jewish merchants from Old Cairo in the 11th and 12th century. For their part, in an equally famous work, North, Wallis, and Weingast classify all human societies into three categories: the forging order of human gatherer societies, the natural state that appeared sometime between 5 and 10 millennia ago and lasted until around 1800, and what they're interested in, the so-called, what they call open access order, and which they define as societies in which personal relations still matter, but impersonal categories of individuals, often called citizens, interact over wide areas of social behavior with no need to be cognizant of the individual identity of their partners. And they locate the emergence of such open access order in Britain and the United States at the beginning of the early 19th century, the implication being that prior to this period, identity was still predominant. Now, both of these works, and I could have chosen others, raise several issues concerning the relationship between identity as defined outside of the market and its impact on market transactions. For our purposes, I simply note that the scale of analysis is such that it misses a lot of specificity that matter to the author's own argument, I would say, not just because details are important as such. So my suggestion is that we shift perspective a bit, and notably that we explore the same problem, let's say, by taking the foot off the accelerator and looking instead at synchronica comparisons at a more granular level between two European credit markets and test the relative degree of impersonality. And in order to pursue this exercise, I chose something I have some familiarity with, which is the operation of Jewish merchants, particularly those of Iberian descent, also referred to often as Sephardim, in Livorno and Amsterdam between 1590 and 1800, and look at how commercial credit was developed across religious boundaries. I want to warn you that I don't have big conclusive answers, and I would like to share with you the research setup, because I think it's, in this case and in other cases, the research setup is as important as the conclusions that we're going to reach. So why Jews and why Iberian Jews in particular? And put shortly, the fate of former Jews who fled Iberia after the expulsions and forced conversions of the 1490s is a revelatory test case for the degree of impersonality of commercial credit markets, because wherever these Jews were given a safe haven in Western Europe, the Ottoman Empire is outside the bounds of this presentation, but in Western Europe, they entered commercial society along a double track. As merchants, they were given legal parity with the local Christian peers. As Jews, they suffer some legal disabilities outside of the marketplace and were often shunned socially and despised religiously. Now, we know that both status restrictions and contractual equality existed in the early modern European markets, and Jews of Iberian descent embodied this simultaneous condition. And this is why I think we can learn from how they built their business alliances across religious lines. Now, why religion as a measure of impersonality? Obviously, religion means a great many things. Here, I'm not concerned with personal beliefs, but with organized religion. And as an aside, there is obviously, as we all know, there's been a growing interest in cultural and religious belief among a number of quantitative economic historians. That's not the kind of angle I'm taking here, in part because I still want to retain the notion that culture is a puzzle as opposed to something that we can identify, something hermetically sealed that can be passed on and transferred. So I treat religion first and foremost as a category of ascription. That is, as a proxy for legal status. In pluriconfessional cities and regions, religion as a category of ascriptions determine the legal capacity and property rights of all individuals who openly professed a recognized faith and belong to its organizational structure. At the same time, religion also informed cultural views that transcended purely legal divisions. And this is particularly true for how majority perceived tolerated minorities. In England and the United Provinces, not only Jews, but particularly Catholic as well. In Catholic areas, the so-called Lutherans, which was a generic term under which a lot of many non-Catholic were grouped. Now, legal norms and cultural change do not always co-evolve. Otherwise, today, since we have anti-discrimination laws, we would not have discrimination. But legal norms and cultural change do need to be considered alongside one another. How did religious affiliation and cultural perceptions affect individual reputation? This is the kind of million-dollar questions we're interested in when we try to understand how merchants in these very diverse port cities and also non-port cities judge one another. When and how religious and confessional identity matter, and when it did not, and in their own assessment of each other's creditworthiness. Business letters are a good place to go to start asking these questions, but they're rarely straightforward. However, they are rich in clues, and this is one clue I'd like to share with you. This is a merchant in Leeds in 1781, replying the following to his son, who has asked him for advice about whether to form a partnership with a certain Mr. Merak, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, it's a Scottish name, Scottish last name. It is a very weighty affair to form a partnership and requires deliberation and inquiries. As to Mr. Merak, he may or may not be a person of probity, Adam Smith term, and honor, and therefore it behoves you to enter into no connections with him, but what are mere commissions. So here we don't have the issue of religion explicitly, but we have a very important distinction between partnership and commission agency. And it is this cautionary piece of advice from father to son that reminds us that business alliances were not yes or no, they were always a matter of degree. And this is, I cannot emphasize this point enough. Unfortunately, it is exceedingly rare to find explicit statements by merchants about how they form an articulated or calculative process that informed their choices of lenders, borrowers, partners. We have these little clues like this one. And so we need to observe and decipher their practices in order to try to reconstruct the thinking that was behind those choices. And that's something we can do to some extent in Livorno and Amsterdam, which are very interesting candidates for comparisons, both because of their similarities and because of their differences. They were the capitals of the Sephardic diaspora, respectively in the Catholic, in Southern Catholic Europe and in Northern Protestant Europe. They were both cities displayed unparalleled tolerance toward religious minorities by period standards. Amsterdam was a far bigger city, a much larger city, but throughout the 18th century, as you can see, I didn't put, but you can quickly calculate the percentage, Livorno had a much higher percentage of Jewish residents, and both cities had roughly 10% Jewish population in the 18th century. And the reason why there's a difference between Iberian Jews and Old Jews in Amsterdam is because of the successive waves of refugees, Jewish refugees from Central and Eastern Europe that began to arrive in the very end of the 17th century, while in Livorno there is no formal distinctions, or there are plenty of distinctions between the Jewish population. In both Livorno and Amsterdam, Jewish merchants had full access to both contracting institutions supporting private contracts, and property rights institutions. They were not at risk of being arbitrarily expropriated by elites or the government. But there were other legal and social constraints that affected their business strategies. First and foremost, the fact that in neither cities nor nowhere else in Europe did exist civil marriage. So this had repercussions on the circulation of commercial capital and on networks of reputation control, because religious marriage, and therefore intra-group marriage, was the only one that existed at the time. At the same time, the mercantile culture of both cities was widely shared by all merchant communities. There was a flow of personnel between the two cities, which further homogenized the two commercial culture. But unlike many Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, for example, Sephardic Jews did not have their own special language. They wrote and communicated among each other in the local vernacular. And some of their fathers, brothers, and cousins pursued religious education, but most of those who were practicing merchants actually knew very little, if any, Hebrew. Their numerical and alphabetical literacy was likely comparable to that of their non-Jewish peers, since commerce simply required those skills. The upper echelons of Sephardic Jewish mercantile groups had a very high degree of acculturation. Livorno did not have a ghetto and did not require its Jews to wear any distinctive signs on their garments. The very wealthiest of these Jews, that's just to give you a visual representations, were, because of their attires, virtually indistinguishable from the local merchant elite. So there is also no indication that Sephardic merchants operating in major European cities had their own special rationality and not even their own commercial culture. I've looked at a few of those that exist, how-to manuals written by Sephardic merchants and printed, and they display no difference from the kind of contemporary Christian equivalent that they use as their models. At some point, an Amsterdam Sephardic Jew by the name of David de Tartas decided to launch a Spanish-language gazette, La Gazeta de Amsterdam, thinking that there would be an audience for this initiative, but it failed very soon, most likely because it did not contain any news that was not available in the very many Dutch, English, and French gazettes to which Jews and non-Jews in Amsterdam had access. For all their similarities and connections, Livorno and Amsterdam also represented two opposite governance regimes. Livorno afforded maximum corporate autonomy to the Jewish community and to some extent to other foreign consular representatives, something that in a book that Manuela kindly mentioned, I called communitarian cosmopolitanism, which in principle should be an oxymoron, but I think it's an apt description of that world. And Amsterdam, by contrast, the municipality of Amsterdam, by contrast, forbade all foreign merchants and all ethno-religious communities from establishing semi-autonomous organizations, and in exchange, made no distinction between local and foreign merchants when it came to charging custom duties or providing legal and financial services. And for this reason, Oscar Hendelblum calls it the first mercantile open access order. Now, to pursue our comparisons between these two commercial hubs, we need to get to a more specific level of institutional comparisons of the conditions under which Jewish merchants operated. Because there are some differences in the way in which they matter, it's up to us to appreciate. So in Livorno, both in Livorno and Amsterdam, I said, Jewish merchants had full property and contractual rights. In Livorno, these were spelled out. In Amsterdam, they came by default. In both cities, there was no ghetto, and Jews had were not required to wear any distinctive signs. In Livorno, they had formal protection from the Inquisition, but there was an Inquisition in Tuscany. Well, there was no Inquisition in Amsterdam, and this does matter, because they were fleeing from Iberia, or their ancestor had been in Iberia, by definition, according to Catholic canon law, they could be accused of apostasy and therefore submitted to the tribunal of the Inquisition. Interestingly, in Livorno, because it was a new town, there were no guilds. So there was no formal restrictions against Jews operating in manufactures, as it's something that happens more or less across Europe. There were Jews who had large coral manufacturers, but also were involved, for example, in tobacco cultivation and processing. While in Amsterdam, they were excluded from guilds with very few exceptions. The charters that allowed Jews to settle in Livorno included prohibition against what today we would call hate crimes. In Amsterdam, we can infer from the Jewish community status that there was fear of outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence that was not legislated. Most significantly, both cities had an organized Jewish life, but the way it was organized was very different in relation to the state. Livorno had a Jewish nation, so to speak, a Jewish community fully recognized, that had the greatest jurisdictional autonomy ever achieved in the pre-modern period, and Professor Eveline Ollier-Gross has presented on the topic in one of the sessions at this conference. Jews, like every other minority confessions, except for Catholics, in the United Provinces, were allowed to have some form of congregational or religious organization, but with very limited internal disciplinary power. Interestingly, in a few documents, scholars have found that the Jewish nation could be referred in Dutch as a Jewish church, and that limited the degree to which the Jewish community policed its own members. The relationship to the local Christian civil and criminal jurisdictional organization was also different, because Jews who were litigating with other Jews in Livorno had to first appear before the Jewish tribunal, which was administered by merchants themselves, and could only appeal to Christian courts in appeals. While in Amsterdam, there was no formal commercial and civil Jewish court, and Jews were treated as any other merchants. And in both cities, they had access to full panoply of financial services that was notably greater in Amsterdam. And this has, there's two sides to this. Most scholars study the East India Company in Amsterdam rather than sort of small and medium enterprises. But here, Oscar Henderblom also has shown that there is a link that should be explored further about the investments in East India Company stocks and the possibility of financing private business. So how did this mixture of equality and subordination in the two institutional settings affect business strategies? Did Jews in Amsterdam have a much wider circle of non-Jewish associates and creditors? This is a reasonable assumption, but we need to test it if we wish to understand how merchant reputations worked and how social groups responded to institutional incentives. And at risk of tiring you to something I don't want to even spell, given the hour and the day, before I proceed with my comparison, I need to consider another additional layer of the research setup, which are the sources. And I want to emphasize this is a tedious but important step, because, for example, in the famous comparisons between Genoese and Maghrebi in the medieval Mediterranean, the compatibility of the two sets of sources is something that we should discuss more, and it's quite problematic. Now, I've gone way too far. No, let's see. In both Livorno and Amsterdam, we do not have a full business census. So we cannot know what is the proportion of a certain forms of enterprise organization versus another. In Livorno, we have very few almanacs that begin to be published only at the very end of the 18th century, so we also don't know, except for a few administrative reports, what is the full list of merchants operating there. While in Amsterdam, there is a fairly rich set of almanacs that would allow you to get a sense of what are the names of the merchant communities. In Livorno, to the surprise of undistinguished colleagues or scholars of notaries, there are few and poor, for the commercial credit purpose, notarial records. So for reasons that you will all know, I picked 1751. I see Professor Gilles Postelvinet laughing at me a little bit. But just to show you, these are all the notarial records that survive in Livorno for these years. And the only one pertaining to commercial credits are protest of bills of exchange and powers of attorney. There actually are virtually no partnership contracts in Tuscan notarial records after the 13th centuries, because partnership records that were sealed privately had standing in court. So notarial records don't tell us very much about some aspects of business organization in Tuscany, while in Amsterdam, they're fairly rich, I'll return to a moment, And there are very few business letters surviving in Amsterdam. And this is important because what business letters and what notaries tell us are very different things. Business letters are fairly rich in Amsterdam. In Livorno, I thought I am missing, okay, this is what I wanted to show you first. So in Livorno, there are some collection of business letters, this is a large one I studied, that tells us that if we look at commission agency, what the father told his son to remember the distinction. In fact, when it came to choosing commission agent who were remunerated percentage-wise overseas, Sephardic merchants were very ecumenical. In fact, they often reached to Christians, or in some cases in India. This is not a particularly striking map. I would never win a digital humanities competition. But there is a little sign to Goa in India, and their commission agents, for example, were all Hindus. So we cannot make a full comparisons because in Amsterdam we don't have the same sources, and you would not use a notarial record to sign up a contract with a commission agent. The court records are also very different in this matter. They've not been exploited as much as they could, but all Christian court records exist in Amsterdam, in Livorno, while in Amsterdam, the municipal court records did not survive, which is a great pity, and we can only use appeals courts. Now, what are the findings, finally? How did Jews, from what we can glean through these sources, organize their businesses? Now, since Max Weber, it has been assumed that limited partnerships, in which there are limited passive investors and a separate legal entity, are a good measure of the depersonalization of the market. So what is the picture of legal partnerships in Livorno and Amsterdam? In Livorno, we have, as part of an extraordinary record of Tuscan records, all surviving limited partnerships from the middle of the 15th through the early 19th century. And we see that the first limited partnership formed among Jews in Livorno dates to 1670, and that between 1670 and 1808, there are only 91 of them. And if we look for limited partnerships in which there are both Jewish and non-Jewish investors, there's only 13 of them very late, in the late 18th century. And this is sort of contrary to a lot of assumptions I can go into. It's part of a work in progress I'm conducting. If we turn to, and I should add that these 13 limited partnerships, including Jews and non-Jews, are not all about important financial or mercantile ventures. As you can see here, many are for small local manufacturing. So for sure, we can say, given the size of the mercantile community of Livorno, the limited partnership by far never became the preferred form of business organization, in spite of the fact that the legal technology was there and the toleration was there. If we turn to Amsterdam, and here I'm borrowing from a very recent paper by someone who belongs to the research group of Bram van Hofstraten at the University of Maastricht, who surveyed all notarial archives in Amsterdam every 10 years between 1701 and 1791, and found a total of 56 limited partnerships that had at least one Jewish investor, which is also very little. And of these, the author says that 46% are Jewish family firms. I'm not exactly sure what it means, but I presume she means that all investors are Jewish, meaning that, basically half are intra-Jewish partnership. So let me take stock of where we are and approach the conclusion. I would say that overall, the evidence about the degree of impersonality of the commercial credit market in Amsterdam and Livorno is mixed. Limited partnerships that are supposed to favor that impersonalities are very few in both places. Yes, I had said this before. There is a lot of commission agency that includes very diverse pools of actors. In Amsterdam, there is ongoing research on notarial records. This is from work published by Professor Katia Antunes that divides a large sample of notarial deeds between cross-cultural, namely those that include Jews and non-Jews, and the others. And you do see that, yes, there is change over time, but there are extraordinary variation depending on the type of contract. So, something like a marine insurance that is highly standardized may involve a lot of Jews and non-Jews, while other, surprisingly, bills of exchange don't, for example. There is, in another piece co-authored with Professor Felipe Ribeiro de Silva, Antunes also showed how the degree of cross-cultural relations in Amsterdam notarial records varied by region. There is also work by Daniel Stroom that for a slightly earlier period that looks at the so-called new Christians, the sort of baptized Jews in Iberia between 1595 and 1629 in Amsterdam and Oporto, and shows that intra-group agents, other new Christian agents, tended to be preferred for complex arrangement, but simple tasks, for example, freight contract, were often entrusted to outsiders. So where does all this evidence point? To me, it points to the notion of gradation, in the sense that identity matters to some degrees and in different ways, depending on a multiplicity of variables, the type of contractual obligations, the kind of information market and asymmetries in different locations, and institutional and cultural environments. And this is the point that I wish to hammer and drive home, that there is not a yes or no impersonality degree, but rather that the task for us is to assess and glean at the influence of the multiple variables that produce these outcomes. And I think this is a crucial task to understand pre-modern markets as they were expanding in the early modern period, but it also has implication for long-term historical development and for how we think about discrimination, which is where I started. Because discrimination comes in many different forms. It can be legalized and violent, but it can also be hidden and more insidious. And history, to repeat, is not about it's not about the glass being half full or half empty. So let me wrap up and conclude to say that credit obligations across religious groups were ubiquitous in early modern Europe, but social and legal barriers were also ubiquitous. And obviously, we need more data, we need more empirical evidence to establish when and how identity matter in commercial credit relations and how merchants built and managed their reputation. But we also need to clarify and decide which analytical frameworks we use to gather and analyze such data. To some of you in the audience, what I presented may appear more like business history than economic history. And I ask myself, does the difference matter? And I always welcome exchanges on how disciplinary boundaries shape our approaches to complex historical process of change. Here, I try to make an argument for the importance of a meso-level comparative analysis, one that is neither micro nor macro, one that recognizes institutional differences, but is also mindful of additional other variables, including asymmetries in archival records. And my hope is that we pursue more comparative research at this meso level and incorporate its results in our grand narratives. Thank you, and have a very good August to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francesca, for this inspiring lecture. I think that we can open the floor to discussion. If you have any questions, please go close to the micro. Yeah, there, just there, and ask, please, your questions. Yes, you have to go to the micro if you have any question, or...
Thank you for your fascinating presentation. So, if I understand correctly, the framework by North, Weingast and Wallis is a bit binary, too much binary, between open access societies and natural states.
Would you like me to comment on that, or is that the premise of your comments?
What is your opinion on this?
Well, I mean, they explicitly write, for those of you who remember, that their approach is not teleological, but they're trying to outline a series of historical, a landscape that can produce a certain outcome, which is obviously an important point of departure for any social scientific inquiry. However, the landscape they map is fairly selective. So for whom is society open access in 18th century Britain and the United States? Not for women or under coverture, not for slaves. And so there is a bit of an implied notion of, the cascade of rights that once, that used to inform certain kind of grand narratives. And so you're free to espouse those, but I don't think they're particularly helpful, in my view, even to explain the famous question that has been repeated at many plenary sessions at this conference is, how did we get here? And I think that question has to begin with, how do we agree on what here is and where we are? So that would be my response.
Could you just introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Pierre Gervais. I was wondering, you presented a study of people dealing with Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam and Livorno. And I was wondering if you had considered the possibility that some of the variation you were seeing between people having partnerships with Jews or having dealings with Jews or not were actually religious political choices in some ways on the part of some of those merchants who would be more prone to anti-Judaism than others. In other words, among non-Jews, you would have populations which would be ready to deal with Jews more than others. That not everybody would be equally open, shall we say.
Thank you, Pierre, for your question. I mean, I think this is one, we have to find out. We can just not assume that. And the size of the archives in Amsterdam are daunting. But I actually don't think I've shown a lot of differences for now. I don't want to deny that there are differences, but I think we have. This is an example in which we have to establish which were the differences, in fact.
Hello.
Okay.
Yes.
Koji Yamamoto from the University of Tokyo. Thank you so much for a really fascinating lecture. I was wondering if you could comment on how economists might respond to the kind of research that you're going to be doing, and what we as economic historians can do to foster the critical dialogue between economic historians alert to and working with, with archival sources, and the economist and social scientist interested more primarily in which variables predominate. Thank you.
Thank you, Koji. I really cannot answer the first question. I mean, I, live with this question, as you and many others. I am genuinely and fully committed to this dialogue. Otherwise, I wouldn't devote a fairly considerable amount of my time to the journal that was mentioned, Capitalism, a journal of history and economics. There wasn't any particular reason other than the sound to put one discipline before the other in the subtitle. I think I'm very interested in having a dialogue about what are our premises, what are our goals, and how we build our research. And that's why, I try to share this in my talk. There are a lot of steps in what we do in which we could talk to each other and to a multiplicity of other disciplines, because, this is a simplification of the kind of disciplinary influences or political scientists to economic anthropologists, a few who survive, and others who may influence some of us. I taught at Yale for 14 years and spent a considerable amount of time completely unaccounted by my department, the history department, in the program of economic history that was housed in the economics department, and we had 2 meetings a week, both with external speakers and with graduate students from different disciplines. And we were completely aware with my colleagues in economics that the graduate students would then had to respond to their respective academic job markets. And there's no attempt here to undo the institutional structures that we inhabit, but through, small-scale face-to-face conversations, I think we were trying to enrich both sides of the training, for example. And I think there are a number of initiatives. This is just something but there are several numbers of summer schools or workshops, and the more we have, and I think ideally, the more sessions, of World Economic History conferences could be devoted to this specific problems, or to bring a certain kind of interdisciplinary diversity to the table. I think I've learned tremendously and benefited tremendously from those kind of conversations.
I would like just to ask you if there is a last question, because it's already 7:30, as you know. If there is no question, I can maybe just...
Thank you so much, Francesca. That was absolutely wonderful. Just wanted, sorry.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted you mentioned this two sorts of discriminations between violent forms of discriminations on more latent forms. And I think that latent discriminations has, it's very important to stress as latent discrimination also can have a strong impact as much as violent discrimination. And I think on the long run, it has impact on the long run, on the longue durée, because it also impacted the way the historiography was written. And I think I work on other Jews, Ashkenazim, and I think the historiographical heritage has been so much impacted by these latent discriminations that there is a huge work to, as you say, gather data and rethink the theoretical frame. So thank you so much. It's so important to stress this sort of ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liliane. I should say that in Italy, like in Africa, we actually open, I think, if I remember, I grew up in Italy, we open gifts right away, so I'll do that. Thank you so much for your patience. Last night, Anne was complaining that she had a big gift and couldn't put it in her suitcase, so I'm very lucky. We can bargain. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Now, for finishing this wonderful session, I would like to come up on the stage the Paris team, which has been so wonderful. Please come. So here is part of the team. We're not all, we were 20 members, and it was a wonderful team. They did so much, yes. Woo! Keep with us, keep with us.
Everything's all right.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much. And special mention to Patrick Fridanceau, Professor Fridanceau, who did so much for the IEHA in former years, and who invited us to take part to this fantastic events, and also to also members, and special mention to Guillaume Dodin. We made a binôme, a team. Well, wonderful. And I should mention everyone, but well, it would not be very easy, and we are all now desiring to have a rest. But nevertheless, I think I really must thank very warmly this wonderful team. It was huge job. For several years. I think it has been 6 years job because of this special situation. And everyone was always ready. And when one could not do the job, another one would do. It was really harmonious and just exceptional team. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you.
You can
And in the last time of the preparation of the Congress, we were connected quite every day with technical managers of the Congress who did so well. So, it was fantastic for us because without these technicians, we could have done nothing. So thank you so much to the managing team and the technician team. Thank you so much.
And dear Liliane, we have some flowers for you because if the team was great, it was thanks to you. So thank you very much for this adventure.
Thank you very much, Pauline. So now we are very glad to welcome you to have a drink or enjoy the evening. Attention derrière. Oui. Attention. Oui, faites très attention derrière. Oui.
Your soul's is big and true.